I apologize. This is picking up from part one. The computer froze while creating the HDR image. In any case, here is the TIFF image. It doesn't look terribly different from the rest of the images here, but once I go over to the develop module, I can see in exposure that it's greatly expanded. Instead of plus or minus 5 stops, it allows me to go plus or minus 10 stops now, right? So I can make any desired adjustments here in the develop module. My goal is really to have detail while having good contrast in all of the tonal ranges. So I want to see details in the dark and light areas of the image and have the color and so forth as I want it. Once you're satisfied with the image, you can go ahead and export it. I'm going to move on to Photoshop now. Okay. So using these same 6 images, just going to go ahead and select those 6 images. I'm going to go up to Photo, Edit in Photoshop, Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. If Photoshop is not already launched, it should go ahead and launch it for you. It's bringing in all of the files. This may take several seconds to a minute. And then eventually the HDR dialog box will appear. So it's aligning the images and combining all of the data from the various images into a single image. Right, so here is the HDR dialog box. Here you can see down here exposure value +3, +2, +1, 0, -1, -2, and so forth. You can uncheck any of those if you feel that the information is not useful. You can adjust things like exposure right here in this dialog box. I recommend leaving the adjusting to Lightroom once you create the image, but one thing you can experiment with here are the presets. Some of them will be quite exaggerated. Flat, you don't necessarily want a flat image. I quite like the effect of the more saturated in this case, but it is a bit too saturated for my taste. Instead of adjusting the saturation here in Photoshop, I'm going to go ahead and wait until Lightroom to adjust the saturation. You can also remove ghosts. See how that water changed there? I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is and click on OK. That's going to create the file in Photoshop. Okay, so here's my image in Photoshop. Once I click on File Save or Command S on a Mac, Control S on a PC, on the bottom left you can see that it's saving, and that saves a TIFF file into Lightroom. Right, so here is the image that was generated from Photoshop. Now I can go ahead and make any adjustments I like, such as exposure, saturation, and so forth. Gonna get a few more darks into the image. It is a night image. Okay. Once you're satisfied with the image, you'll want to export. This is a very large file, a TIFF file, probably in the neighborhood of 80 to 100 megabytes. So when you export your image, go ahead and File Export from Lightroom. Tell the interface where you want it. Okay. And for this, go ahead and choose JPEG, sRGB, 100% quality, and image sizing. Just go ahead and choose Resize to Fit, Long Edge, 2000 pixels, and go ahead and include all metadata and export. And what you'll be turning in for assignment 2 is your final image. If you could go ahead and take a screenshot in progress of the either Photoshop or Lightroom interface as you're creating the image, that would be terrific too. And then also the contact sheet with the original images used. This might be an exact duplicate of the contact sheet you turned in for assignment 1 this week, but in case you had to reshoot or chose a different set of images, so forth, go ahead and turn in the new contact sheet anyway so we can see the original images. Right, that concludes this walkthrough. Actually, I have one more thing to show you here. This doesn't really have to do with this exact assignment. I just wanted to show you one option you have for HDR in Photoshop working from a single image. Again, this will not be an option for this exact assignment, but if you ever have an image, for example, like this image, where you cannot have details in both the highlights and shadows within the single image without compromising the other. For example, here, if I get good detail in the shadow areas, the highlights are overexposed. And likewise, if I have good detail in the highlight or lightest areas, then the shadow areas are underexposed. You can try the HDR interface in Photoshop on a single image. It works best with RAW, but even on JPEG it works. So I'm just going to go to Photo, Edit in Photoshop. I'm not going to choose HDR because there's only one image. Again, that should open Photoshop for me. So here's the image. So I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, HDR Toning. And again, this is a single image. Okay, and I have a dialog box here similar to the HDR dialog where I was working with bracketed images. Again, you can try some of the presets. I think the more saturated works quite well with this. There's maybe a little bit extra edge glow that I'm not crazy about. Just going to click on OK. Again, this is far too saturated from what I want, but if I go ahead and save the image, it should appear in Lightroom. Here it is. And now I can go ahead and adjust the saturation, for example. I want actually quite a bit more contrast in this image. So I'm using tone curves for that. I might raise overall exposure of the image, but here it's quite exaggerated, but you can really see how you can retrieve a lot of detail just from a single image using that HDR adjustments option in Photoshop. Again, that is not one of the options for this assignment, but just something to keep in mind for your future use. Have a great day.